Hello, and welcome to the Let's Talk About Why podcast. I'm your host, Tara Zimmer, and I'm so glad you decided to tune in today. Here at the Let's Talk About Why podcast, we answer that age-old question, why? Behind every great business, book, leader, and idea, there's a why, and we're here to talk about it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Let's Talk About Why podcast. I'm your host, Tara Zimmer, and I am really excited as we continue our conversation about refugees and immigrants. This week, we have a guest with us, and I would love for you to introduce yourself to our audience and just tell us a little bit about yourself. And then our question of the year for 2025 is, what's one thing on your bucket list that you've done or that you hope to do soon? So tell us your name and that question.
That's great, Tara. Thank you so much for having me. I'm John Mark Bowers. I am the training advisor at World Relief with church and community mobilization. So equipping churches all around the U.S. for welcome, to create communities of belonging and welcome for newly arrived refugees and other immigrants. Across our communities. Specifically, we are passionate about working through local churches, and after hours, I do the same thing. My local church here in Chattanooga, Tennessee is planted in an immigrant neighborhood where I've been living for about 15 years. I started a small housing business here to help immigrants own homes, to buy, purchase, and finance their own homes. So I've done that many times over now in my own community for neighbors on each side of me, even here where I live. And so, yeah, it's really interesting that God has brought this work into my life in so many different ways. I'm married to an immigrant from Ecuador, Tanya, my beautiful wife, and we're raising a bilingual, bicultural family. So it's just been a long trajectory of how the Lord has brought me into this work, and not just as a day job, but really as an embodied way of living.
That's
And
amazing.
yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I look forward to the conversation. I love talking about this stuff. So I think, to get to your first question about 2025, um, what's one thing I'm hoping to do or to have on my bucket list? I think probably the irony is this year I've decided to do less. So to not have bucket list, to try to simplify the hurry and the noise and to be more present.
That's good.
um,
That's good.
just for the way I'm wired and some of my deep um, gifts and also struggles. This is something I just feel the Lord continuing to draw me into, to move away from like a performance mentality and just kind of recentering me to be present with the people that are right here in front of me. So yeah, that's what I'm aiming for this year.
That's really good. No, I totally get that. We've had a couple conversations on the podcast recently about Enneagram, and I'm an Enneagram 3, which is very much like that of let's have all the things and do all the things. So I understand. That's a really admirable goal. And so I hope that you're able to not check that off your list, but not check as many things off your list this year.
Yes. Here we go.
Yes. Well, tell us, you told us a little bit about this, but why do you do what you do at Relief? What drew you into all of these areas, both personally and professionally, to begin with? How did the Lord draw you into these?
Thank you, Tara. I grew up in Latin America as a missionary kid, in Honduras and Costa Rica. And I think, unfortunately, it's not rare that that's actually a really difficult experience for a lot of people.
Mm.
Um, if you dig into kind of the missionary world, you will find a lot of people who have experienced hurt, harm, disillusionment. My parents divorced on the mission field. And so while cross-cultural work was a really important part of my early formation, it also came with a lot of pain that I had to work through. So there were a lot of years through high school and college I really didn't want much of anything to do with this kind of work. And then when I was in college, I had an opportunity to travel back to Latin America. I had some mentors and friends that the Lord really used in my life to bring me back into cross-cultural work. So I ended up going to Vietnam after college to teach English for 4 years, which was, again, just an incredibly formative season where the Lord was healing me, maturing me, humbling me in this work, working in ways that are difficult to describe, like when you see the Spirit work and you know it wasn't you, but it was through you or you were involved. I had so many experiences like that in Vietnam, in Southeast Asia, seeing the Lord work. So when I moved back to the US, I knew I couldn't just do like suburbia church anymore.
Mm.
I wanted to move into the neighborhood here, and I wanted to live this way, embodied, and kind of journey into what it looks like to do that in my own country as well, and to face really just some of the darker parts of our history and culture that need to be addressed honestly and lamented and
Mm.
faced. I think if we're really going to find pathways toward healing in our nation and in the church. And so that's the journey the Lord has taken me on, again, through just waves of like disillusionment and struggle, but also like into deeper hope as
Mm.
well, as you see little glimmers of how real repair is happening. And I think I joined World Relief 3 years ago, and it was just such a beautiful integration of my after hours life
Mhm.
and daytime work, being able to build the capacity of other churches and individuals who are passionate about this work, about the work of welcome and reconciliation. So that's a bit of my journey of what's led me here.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. Um, Such important work that you are doing, and I know there's a lot of confusion and just a lot of things out there that people are hearing. Can you, when people hear the word refugee or immigrant, there are different assumptions or some confusion. Could you help clarify what that really means of who you're reaching and how they arrive here, and is this a legal process, things like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a complex question, and I'm not a legal expert. I will say that just as a caveat. But I think it is there are many legal statuses for immigrants, which is why it is so complex. Specifically for refugees, so World Relief has been since the 70s a partner with the Department of State for resettling legally vetted refugees. So the Department of State works with the Office of Refugee Resettlement to vet people who are experiencing conflict or persecution, violence. They've fled their homelands. A lot of them are displaced even internally within their own countries or in a third country waiting to be resettled somewhere else. And so these are the people that we resettle. That's kind of what a refugee is, um, as opposed to maybe someone who comes to the southern border and seeks asylum and comes to the border and said, I believe I have a credible fear of persecution, or my safety's at risk. I'd like to claim asylum. So that's a different kind of status
Mm-hmm.
um, as well. And then I guess all of those people, then there's my wife, someone who came through the legal pathway of having a fiance and marriage visa, right? So there are a lot of different statuses, refugees, asylum seekers, student visas, work visas, marriage visas, holders. Like those are all kind of different kinds of immigrants. And I'd love to share some free courses with you that we have at World Relief in the workshop.
Yeah.
It's something my team builds actually to help churches and volunteers, curious individuals understand the differences between what does the refugee's journey look like versus what is an asylum seeker and what is their journey. And
Yes.
how do we understand the differences there, and how does World Relief engage there? How can the church engage? So I'd love to share those with you. Want to include them with the show notes as well.
Yes, please. We will definitely put those in the show notes because I know that is a question we're hearing a lot. In my day job, in my role, just working with a lot of Assemblies of God churches, they're just asking, how do we help? How do we serve? What is the need? What is appropriate? Kind of things like that. And so I think that would be really helpful for all of our listeners.
I love
So
that.
thank you for that.
Yeah, I'd love to share.
Well, so that's helpful to understand that along those lines, there are other misconceptions that people, I think, especially Christians right now, have about refugees. What are some of the things that you're hearing that you think are important for us to clarify and have deeper understanding of?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, so I think specifically for refugees, and this applies to other immigrants as well, we're seeing a lot of rhetoric. I mean, I'll call them lies. They're
Yes.
not, they're untrue statements about refugees and immigrants, specifically around the economy and their economic impact and around safety and security concerns. So I think what we see is like one small story and taken out of context or amplified and then that applied to all refugees and immigrants, right? So let's say a refugee comes to the United States or an immigrant comes into the United States and they commit a crime. They should be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law, just like you and I should, if we commit a crime. Um, but when we look at the data, that's not actually the story that we're seeing. In fact, the state of Texas, I believe, is the only state that collects immigration status data along with criminal arrest data, and they found that immigrants are less likely to commit crimes, violent crimes, than US born citizens are as well. If you go into immigrant communities like this one, there is actually a way in which there is less crime because immigrants want to avoid the law. If you think about that, when you travel internationally as well, you're a guest. You don't want to get in trouble in a legal system that is not yours, that you don't understand fully, right? And so, um, even anecdotally, I think in our communities, we can see this, and we know this, that immigrants are actually less likely to commit violent crime than our own citizens are. The same with the economy. For refugees, for example, I'd love to share recorded conversation I had with the Health and Human Services Department
Yeah.
that did a study on this that looked at the economic impact of refugees on the U.S. economy. So certainly, when we resettle a refugee, there are costs. I believe it's around $15,000 per person that the U.S. government pays in services for housing and language learning and job placement to resettle someone. But at about 8 years of their being in the United States, paying into the tax base, they break even. So they sort of pay that off back into the tax base. And by about 20 years, the average refugee, again, some more, some less, but on average, they've paid about $21,000 more into the tax base than they have taken out. And so with a long-term mentality, looking at this, they're actually, contributing billions of dollars of revenue is what this study found into our economy. While there is a short-term investment that we make, they become productive citizens like most anyone else. And I think it's, theologically and biblically, if you believe in the image of God in other people, then this actually makes sense. They're not just a drain.
Yeah.
God created us in his image as creators, like he's a creator. And now sin has marred and tainted some of that, right? So we see that's not perfect in our world. But before that, deep at the core of us, we want to give back. We want to create value in our communities through our work. And refugees and immigrants are no different. In fact, one pastor I love in Chicago, Paco Amador, he says, refugees and immigrants embody like traditional American values. They're low entitlement, they're high entrepreneurship, they're highly spiritual people as well. These are what we think of as traditional American principles and values. And so it's time for our churches to say, like, hey, we reject the misconceptions and lies that are being spread about refugees and immigrants. And it's time to think about embracing them as brothers and sisters, as people who really embody what we say we care about as Americans.
Oh, that's so true. I love hearing that. We have created partisan issues where there aren't partisan issues, and especially for us as Christians to have a viewpoint, we've dehumanized people. It really hit close to my heart. I live in the Central Ohio area, so when Springfield made the news with just how the Haitian refugees were being treated there, it really was just heartbreaking to see these very legal citizens of our country being treated as though they are not Imago Dei, that they are not made in the image of God. And I'd love to hear more of your thoughts of why Christians should care. I mean, you touched on it already, but what are some themes that stand out to you? I talked about this a little bit a couple weeks ago on a solo episode of the podcast of just how Jesus was a refugee and how there's just so much throughout Scripture that talks about that. What are some themes that you've seen?
Yeah, that's great. I think there's so many angles you can think about with this, but I look at it and um, you know, we again, if you want to go back to the pragmatics, which are, I try to listen to the real concerns that people have around this issue. Like this is sort of a non-violent communication practice. Like what is the real concern that someone has? If it's safety or economics, we look at that data. You know, if it's but I think below the surface, actually, a lot of people are afraid of culture change. I think that's actually what is driving this issue. So if you you know, and this is just my perspective. I'm not saying on behalf of World Relief or every Christian, but at the heart of it, if the data says like, and what we see anecdotally is that refugees and immigrants are generally actually a renewing force in our world. It's funny when you think of ICE raids, they're always at workplaces. If these people are criminals, why are you finding them at work? Why are the raids always happening in the workplace? You'd think it would be at the bar or on the, you know, the street corner selling drugs. No, it's always at chicken plants and hotels and restaurants and factories. We need labor. We need work. So actually below those concerns, I think are cultural change issues that people are afraid of. And so the key question I have for the church is, do we find our identity as God's people in our nation state, in our culture? Am I primarily a white American Christian? Is that my primary identity? Or is it larger than that? Is it in being part of the global multicultural family that God has been building since the beginning and moving around mysteriously? We don't understand this perfectly, you know, but we see it throughout Scripture. God calling Abraham and Sarah to go into a different place. Even Hagar, part of that story, right? Ruth, the exile into Jesus. As you mentioned, the movement of people has always been a part of God's work in the world. And often even when we can't see what he's doing, it's a force for renewal. And so this is an opportunity, I think, for the church. I think this is why we should care. As we see our culture changing, it's an opportunity for us to ask who we really believe we are. What is our primary identity? Is it in our culture, our nation? Is that our ultimate hope? And as we see our institutions being dismantled right now, it's a good opportunity for us to ask, is that our hope, or what is our hope in something larger, in this global family? And that's the church that God has been building since the beginning. And he says the gates of hell won't prevail against it. So that's where I'm finding my hope. That's where I'm driving our churches and my own local congregation to explore deeper. As politics has brought this issue into the national conversation, it's an opportunity for us to examine ourselves.
I think that's so good. I am not one who really likes to talk about racial issues or things like that. That's just never been who I am. But I found myself throughout this conversation really feeling like there's just some aspect of it that that when I think about who I am and my ancestors and things like that in our country, it's really interesting to me. I've always loved, one of the things I've loved about my heritage is I've always, when people ask, so where are you from? People never get it right, what my background, things like that. And I'm like, I'm American. Like, I am the melting pot of America in one person. Like, my heritage is not one lane, it's not one track. And I love that it's multifaceted. But only one part of my heritage, which I think some people can't, not everyone can say of, was originally from here, that I am Native American, but I also am the descendant of immigrants. And so to see it, I've always thought, isn't that cool? We want it to all come together. We want to be one united country. We are the United States of America. We want to be united in culture too. And so it's really interesting to me to see how we are kind of shifting to this fear of that, of why is that not okay anymore? Why do we not want to be that? Why don't we want to embrace who we've always been as a country, is a melting pot, that's the best of us. I don't want to go back to the parts that aren't the best of us, but
Hmm.
that is an aspect that I think is the best of who we are, is being a melting pot.
Hmm.
So, how would you respond in light of all of that? A lot of people I hear say, well, we have to take care of our own first, especially within the church. I hear that of, there's so much going on, there's so much pain, so many crises happening on the home front already. We can't bring other people in that have their issues and bring those issues from other countries in here. We have to take care of our own first. How would
Hmm.
you respond to that?
I think it's similar to the question that I posed earlier. Who are our own? Who are our primary own? Are our own American citizens, or is our own the global church?
Yeah.
Where are we holding our primary allegiances? Um, I love the Evangelical Immigration Table is another thing to include in the show notes. They do a lot of advocacy work. World Relief is partnered with them, but they insist that, and they're trying to influence our nation's leaders to think this way too, that we can hold together border security and rule of law and fairness to taxpayers with sensible immigration reform that is just and compassionate, that keeps families together, that honors the dignity of human beings. So, rule of law and compassion and justice are not mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
The culture says, pick one or the other, pick your own. Are you on this side or that side? And we say, like, in the kingdom of God, our God owns all of creation. He's a God of abundance. And America is not ours to own, but to steward then. And so we want the rule of law. We want justice for our people and fairness to our taxpayers. We also want reconciliation, pathways to reconciliation. If there are people, much like the restorative justice movement, we want that applied to immigration. So if there are people who have committed immigration violations, a pathway for them to get right with the law, to pay a fine, come out of the shadows, right? And do whatever's necessary to make that right. The gospel always gives us a pathway to reconciliation. So we want to see an immigration reform and immigration system that mirrors that as well. So that stands in pretty stark contrast to take care of our own. It depends on what that means, right,
Mm-hmm.
to you as a believer. And I would just call believers to say that, man, 30% or so of the people that were resettled in the United States last year were from nations where Christians are persecuted. That's an Open Doors report. Um, and this year we've decided to close the resettlement program completely
Mm-hmm.
under this administration. So for me, that is not taking care of our own.
Yeah.
If we believe our own are the global church, we've just closed the door on globally persecuted Christians. I mean, those are the realities. It's a good question I would put back to people who say that. Who are your own?
Yes. And are we allowing the politics to supersede our faith
Yes.
and become partisan and feel like we have to align our faith with a party, which is a whole
Mm,
nother conversation.
yeah.
um,
That's historically always gotten the church in trouble. I mean, just from the beginning,
yeah,
is
we're not.
aligning ourselves with power structures. It's all Jesus is talking about is, these people who have taken over the religious system, controlling power. They're taking over the temple even, right? The Pharisees and Sadducees, like it's all he's talking about is how much we miss the mark when we do that, when we try to do that.
Yeah, we're not good at following on the right side of scripture, not just the right side of history, but the right side of scripture when it comes to political matters throughout history, not in modern history, but throughout history. You're right. It's really good. So I think that in my experience, stories are really powerful. And so I would love either if you have a story you'd like to share that it's impacted you personally or that you've seen the church respond to well, or if you just want to talk about how you've seen people's hearts change when they've come face to face with someone who's going through this kind of journey. I think that it's easy to talk about a concept, but when we actually put a face and a name and a story to that, it changes our reaction.
I totally agree. Yeah, in fact, I sort of think of it as a triangle. Like there's facts, like we talked about earlier. What are the facts around immigration and refugee issues? What does the data actually say? And then scripture is another angle of that. What does the scripture say? And for this, like you said, this for immigration, it shouldn't be partisan. I mean, it's all throughout the Old and New Testament. It's pretty clear the way the church should engage with the foreigner, um, and the sojourner. And then proximity or relationship is the other piece of that too. Knowing people's stories um, changes you. If you sit across the table at dinner from a refugee who's fled violence in Afghanistan or Ukraine or Venezuela, if you chat in my front yard with my undocumented neighbors, um, and come into their home and meet their children and get to know them, you will have a different perspective um, when you engage with a real person. And I totally agree with that. One thing I've loved in my own local church is there is an older couple, they are in their 60s and just ESL teachers, really passionate hearts for the community. And they've befriended this immigrant family who are mixed status. She's a citizen, he is not. And they have several kids in our church. And, there's a lot of complexity there. There's language barriers, there are different generations, there's cultural differences, there's status differences, right? To see that relationship flourish over the years is such a beautiful testimony to me that the gospel is true, that it changes people, it brings people together, that our own can be not just people who speak like us or look like us or think exactly like us, to see the unity and the mutual friendship growing there. That just gives me such hope for the church, for my own community. It's why I keep showing up at my church, right? It's why young people keep showing up, even though, the institutional church systems are broken. The church is in decline, I think, for a lot of good reasons, sadly. But this is what keeps me coming back when I see that there's something new and different and real is here among the people of God. And those kids refer to that older couple as they use the words for grandma and grandpa when they are with them. It's so beautiful to see that kind of relationship form. I think that is a true testimony. It's true evangelism to the world, that what Jesus said, the new kind of community that he came to set up in the world, is real and living and active, no matter what politics or larger cultural issues are happening at the local level. To see those kind of things unfolding are just a beautiful testimony. It just renews me.
That is so special. That is incredible. And it's true. When you are sitting alongside someone, you're not worrying about their documentation status. You are getting to know them as a human, as a person next to you.
I totally agree. And I mean, let's be honest. Documentation status, and those are real issues, and there is real harm. And a lot of people who have come to the United States without documents are fleeing real traumas and violence, poverty, usually. And that's what gets complicated. They might not actually have a claim for asylum, a lot of people, like a real credible fear of persecution. But they are escaping material poverty to go to a place where, there's jobs available to them, even though at the border, that we often say, it's really interesting. You get to the US border and there are 3 signs. One of them says, keep out, and the other 2 say, help wanted, help wanted. So there's work for you if you come here. And we're saying, we're doing this. Don't come, but if you do, there's more work than you can even do, and than one person can do in a 24-hour day for you. So, and if you're fleeing poverty, you understand why someone would do that. And so it gets really complex, even though they don't have a credible claim to be for asylum or to receive like legal status. This is why our system needs reform. Our
Yeah.
system needs reform to accommodate the labor needs we have. And in some ways, when they send money back home, this is what all of our neighbors do that aren't documented. They're sending money monthly back home to their family members, to their aging parents, to cousins, to children, right? And so these are called remittances. In some ways, remittances, you could argue, are some of the best kind of aid
Mm.
that there is, because instead of saying like the US government should be sending money to the government of Guatemala, and we all know the bureaucracy and the potential for corruption there, right? Like if a person who knows another person can work and earn that money and send it back. Now, that's not perfect, and there are a lot of stories of how that creates other problems. But in some ways, I mean, some of these economies in Latin America, their GDP is made up a large part from remittances, from foreign
Wow.
workers who go abroad to Europe and America and Canada, and they send money back into the economy. And so, these are the complexities
Yeah.
of real human stories and lives. I know people want to say they should just come the legal way. And we want to say, well, there is not really a legal way. And we need workers. And so until our Congress can learn to cooperate, and this is why we're influencing them through advocacy, through the Evangelical Immigration Table to say, you've got to repair this broken system so that it works for us and for labor workers um, toward human flourishing. That's what we want to see.
Yeah. No, that is true. It's so complex, all of the different pieces. I think where I struggle sometimes to wrap my head around the logic of it all is that with the exception of Native Americans, nobody here that's making these decisions is descended from anyone who should have been here in the first place, according to our current policies. So it's just baffling to me. Like, if you're mad about it, you shouldn't have been here either.
And doesn't that
But
mean we doesn't that mean that we should hold all of this with so much humility
yes,
as we discern reform that will serve our nation? Because all of us are stewards, not owners of this land. And that's not even necessarily, you don't even have to be a believer to recognize that, right? But how much more for those of us who are believers, who are stewards of what God has given us, to think about what does it look like to steward this land well. And the Old Testament gives us a lot of beautiful principles in Sabbath, in the gleaning laws,
mm,
for how to include the foreigner and the widow and the orphan, right? Leaving the edges of your fields ungleaned so that they can come and work and have access to the means of work to provide for themselves, right? It wasn't shutting them out. In fact, Leviticus says, like, so that they might dwell with you in the land. It's also
mm,
not a handout either. It's saying, here is an appropriate way for you to come and work. God didn't say, give them your farm, or nationalize it. He said, dwell among them, come and allow them access to glean. And the year of Jubilee, at the end of all that, Sabbath and Jubilee practices, right? These kind of lost dreams that God had for the world, for how this was all supposed to work, right? That at the 49th year, right, everything was set right again. Slaves were freed, ancestral lands went back to the original owners. God seems to care more about togetherness and equity and everyone sharing a stake in the land than anyone's personal right
yeah,
to their own private property or to their own money and that's, oh man, now we're getting into like dangerous territory when you talk to Americans, because we really believe in those things, and I believe in those things. I own
yeah.
property, I own rental property. I'm a I'm definitely a landowning male, which have been typically the people calling the shots, I think, in our nation. But I think we hold all of that with a humility, that we are stewards and looking at the principles God has given us to apply. That's where I think the church needs to go.
Mm, that's so good. Well, speaking of, what are some tangible ways that churches and individuals can welcome and walk alongside refugees in their communities right now?
Yeah, that's good, Tara. Thank you. So we have lots of resources depending on where your church is um, in this process. If you would like to join our Churches of Welcome membership, I want to make a special invite to your network to do that. Um, we are journeying alongside of churches and equipping you to think about how you can disciple your congregations into this work of welcome. So some churches might be just starting out and learning how to think about this. So we have a small group curriculum that we can help you set up called Welcoming the Stranger, where you can walk through kind of the things we've been talking about on this call. What does the Bible say about immigration? What are the facts? How do we respond kind of just at a basic level, glean more understanding? If your church is ready to get going, or maybe is more of a we learn by doing, we have opportunities to pack welcome kits for refugee families or to do more tangible, practical things like that. We also have a program called Good Neighbor Teams, where churches form like a small group of neighbors who commit to walking alongside of a newly arrived refugee family for the first 6 months to a year of their time in the United States. And World Relief will equip you through Churches of Welcome to be able to do that, to walk alongside that family and make sure that they know how to get on the bus line and how to register kids for school, right? And learning to navigate new systems with a heart for welcoming them into your church, into your faith community, not out of coercion, but simply out of the radical love and welcome that Jesus gives to each of us into his family. And so there are all different ways your church can engage, kind of depending on where you are. We'd love to have you more. And if you would like to explore it, I'll leave you some links for your show notes as well on that.
Yes.
And I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has.
Yes, please do that because I want people to find a small step they can take, whether it's just praying about this or and exploring the idea or getting involved. So, if your church isn't involved, are those things that an individual can do as well? Or,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we tend to focus on equipping churches who walk alongside of, that's kind of World Relief's mandate, but we have individual volunteers or maybe just Christians of compassion who are interested, who are not maybe connected to an institutional church, who want to get involved. We have all kinds of opportunities, courses and learning opportunities in the workshop that I'll share as well to learn and grow more in this space. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I will drop that all in the show notes so that people can get connected because this is the issue of the moment. This is the crisis, I would say, of our nation right now is how do we as the church respond? And I don't mean the physical church, but we as the members of God's church, the global church, how do we respond to this and respond well? Are there any other pieces or things that you would like to encourage listeners in right now or challenge the American church regarding refugees right now?
Yeah, this is good. I think in closing, I just want to thank you for this conversation. And I will say, as we invite you into Churches of Welcome, as we invite you to engage in walking alongside of vulnerable people, immigrants, and refugees, I want to put one more challenge out there that this is not just a problem or a crisis to respond to. This is an opportunity for your church to grow. If you look at where the church is growing, it is the immigrant church in our nation. Again, back to that question of where is our primary identity? The church that is growing is the immigrant church. The immigrant church, though they might have less economic means than some of us do, this is where God is at work around the world. And if you look at even Philip Jenkins' work about global Christendom, I mean, this is where the gospel is growing, is in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And it's on the decline in Europe and North America. I mean, those are just the facts of where the church is growing. I think the missionary narrative needs to be flipped. We actually need immigrants to come and renew us spiritually. So when we receive a family into our community, it's not just us helping them, we need to be asking questions like, it seems like the church is growing radically in your nation. What are you doing? What is the spirit? Where is the spirit? How is the spirit at work? How can we tap into that? Because I don't know about you, but if the spirit is on the move, I want to be there. I want to be part of that story. I don't care what culture you're part of. I want to be there, right? And that's the mindset shift that I believe the refugee and immigrant crisis, the global displacement crisis is creating for us, specifically for the American church. Will we receive the spiritual renewal that is available to us as God continues to move people around? He always has since the beginning. And my colleague Daniel Yang wrote a great book on this called Inalienable: How Marginalized Kingdom Voices Can Renew the American Church. And that's what this is all about, flipping the narrative, to think about how God might be renewing us in surprising ways through immigrants and refugees. It's an opportunity. Will we take it?
That is so good. Every word that you just said, that was so good. It reminds me of something my husband often says to me, which is when God's trying to grow you, he usually lets you be or makes you uncomfortable. And I think that that's where we are as a church right now. That's so good to think of it in that way, that he wants to grow us. He's offering and opening up that next door for us. Do we want to receive it, or do we want to retreat from it out of comfort?
It's not going to look the way that it always has. And you're right. So will we step into that? It's a tension. Will we push that away and say, that's too much? I want things to be the way they always have. Or will we embrace and open our hearts to where God is leading and how he is changing his church? We can be confident. We can rest in him because he says the gates of hell will not prevail against it. He is building and renewing his church. I still believe the Spirit is active and renewing the world. Though sometimes, as John Guerra, a famous and a favorite singer-songwriter, says, sometimes it feels like the gates of hell are prevailing. They will not. The Lord will ultimately have his way. And so we can rest in that, even as the forms of all of this shift. It's an invitation for us to renewal.
And it might mean that he didn't say that our country is what is going to rescue us or what's going to be strong in this. It doesn't have to be. The church is what needs to be strong in this. And I love my country. I love the U.S. I love it. But my ultimate hope does not rest in what our country is going to do in the midst of this. It rests in what God's going to do through us if we let him. Thank you so much for your words. Thank you for your encouragement. Thank you for taking the time to do this. I hope that people have been encouraged. I hope that you will check out all the resources that will be in the show notes. And thank you again for being on the podcast today. And check out World Relief as a whole. I'm a huge fan of everything that World Relief does.
Thank you so much. Yes, I definitely will. Happy to share anything that would be helpful. And it's been a delight to speak with you today, Tara. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for listening today. If you enjoyed the show, hit subscribe so you won't miss an episode. And I would so appreciate if you took a moment to review the podcast on your favorite podcasting platform. That way others can find the show too. If you'd like to connect with me outside of the show, you can find me on socials, especially Instagram and Facebook. I'm at Tara C. Zimmer in all the places. Thanks again, and see you next time.